Y'all, I just started talking like we do on Zoom. Hello, NCAE family. How are you doing today? It's me, Tamika Walker Kelly, your favorite music teacher and NCAE president. And pleased to kick off a new season, season 4 of Tuesdays with Tamika with you. Now, it was so exciting to be with so many NCAE members as delegates this past weekend, literally just a few days ago, as we came together for our first in person NCAE convention since 2019. And we had a very busy weekend as we were making decisions about our NCAE and the future of public education. So, I am pleased also to kick off this season with our first guest. Now, let me bring him on up to the screen. We have with us the Kris Nordstrom from the North Carolina Justice Center, and we can't wait to talk to him this evening. So, Kris, you can unmute and then say
All
hello
right.
to the people today.
Well, thank you for having me on, and it's a pleasure to be with you tonight.
It is very exciting to be with you. As you know, Kris is one of my Twitter friends. He gets all the Twitter love from me. But we have him here today because it is budget season here in North Carolina. And Kris, you have a wealth of knowledge around the North Carolina budget process. And before we get into that though, we want you to tell us a little bit about yourself. So tell us about your background.
Sure. Well, I've been working in education policy in North Carolina for 17 years at this point. Someone asked me that last night, and I did the math, and I was like, oh my gosh, 17 just is so long. It sounds so much longer than it feels like. Um, First 9 of those years, I spent at the North Carolina General Assembly in their nonpartisan fiscal research division. So what we do there is we help them put the budget together. It's sort of our main responsibility. We tell them how much stuff is going to cost, and we try to turn their ideas, for better or worse, into a functioning budget. So spent there 9 years. In the last 8 years, I have been with the North Carolina Justice Center doing research and advocacy to benefit low-income North Carolinians.
Excellent, excellent. Kris has been doing great work for quite some time on the behalf of North Carolina citizens. And so you are a gem, a treasure to the state, and we deeply appreciate you. Yeah, so I first let me say to the educators who are watching, thank you for tuning in. And if you know an educator who needs to know this information, go ahead and share this broadcast with them because we don't want them to miss out on what we're talking about today. And so, Kris, let's talk budget. So,
Alrighty.
can you explain to our attendees watching, our viewers, how does the budget process work here in North Carolina, and what should people be looking for?
Alrighty. Well, the budget process really is sort of a year-long process. It starts up almost as soon as as soon as the budget's signed, the next year's budget process starts, and that starts with gathering information from agencies. So the governor's budget office sends out instructions to agencies to try to gather information, let them formulate their budget requests. So for education, that's the state board creating their budget request. Generally, they do that in coordination with the state superintendent. Some years they have separate budget requests. Some years they have unified budget requests. But the governor takes that information. That information goes to the General Assembly as well. First step then after that is that the governor produces his or her budget recommendations. And the governor's budget, even though we think of the governor as sort of the big dog in the state, the governor's budget recommendations are simply recommendations. And I will tell you from my time as a legislative staffer that they don't carry a ton of weight. Even when the governor and the General Assembly are of the same party, they don't. The General Assembly really is the one that gets to set the budget, and they don't always pay a ton of mind to what the governor wants in their budget. So we've gone through that step. Governor Cooper released his budget recommendations in the middle of March, and from my editorial perspective, I'd say it's a pretty strong budget. It did some important things. It fully funded the years 4 and 5 of the Leandro plan, setting North Carolina on track to finally have constitutional education system by the 2028 school year. So that's incredibly important to working conditions for teachers across North Carolina. And of course, the other thing Governor Cooper recommended were some pay raises that over the biennium, if every teacher stayed and they got their 2 steps over the biennium, they would average a 19% pay raise, which is that's maybe not all the way where we need to be, but it's good progress to getting to where we need to be. So he has released his recommendations, and last week we finally saw the House's recommendations. So the General Assembly chambers take turns. This is the House's year to go first. This year and next year, the House will be the first ones to put forth their budget proposals, and they put their budget proposal out last week. It's not as good. The year-over-year change in total funding is, less than 1%. They do less than 10% of the Leandro plan, and over the biennium, teachers would get about an average of a 10% raise. So they put that out last week. It has to go through some committees before it passes out of the House chamber. So it went to their Appropriations Committee, the Finance Committee, and should be on the floor of the House this week. I'm not exactly sure when, but it will be voted out of the chamber. Following that, the Senate takes their turn at putting together a budget. The House finished up pretty early, sort of, compared to many years. The Senate might put their budget out mid-May, early May. Generally, whoever goes second tends to wait a little bit to get some more information on revenue projections, see how tax collections are coming in. Oftentimes that gives them a little bit more money to work with, though the Senate is not necessarily interested in having more money to work with because they've created some arbitrary spending limits that they've agreed to that are sort of not impacted by additional revenue. They're impacted by, and they're not impacted by the needs of the state. They're purely artificial, arbitrary limits decided by their ideology. So after the Senate puts together their budget, let's say in mid-May, they will pass it out of their chamber, and then they will have 2 budgets that have differences. The chambers will appoint what's called a conference committee to work out those differences and create sort of a final conference budget. Once those differences have been worked out, ideally they're supposed to do that by the end of June, when our state's fiscal year ends. Then we'll go to the governor's desk, and he'll have 10 days to sign it. If he doesn't sign it, if he does veto it, of course, can be overturned with a now potentially a veto-proof majority in the General Assembly, according to the news we're hearing today. Maybe a flip in one of the House members. They might have a veto-proof majority. So that's really, sort of the quick version of the process. I'm certainly happy to answer questions to fill in any gaps and details folks have.
Well, thank you for giving us that rundown. And you share with us, yes, so the governor has put out his proposal. The House just recently put out theirs. And you mentioned that the Senate might not put theirs out until mid-May. Do you have any inklings about what might show up in the Senate's version of the budget?
Well, I'm not hoping for much. Traditionally, the Senate has been the lower spending of the 2 chambers. The one that is, even dates back to when Democrats controlled the legislature. That it just seemed that the House was a little bit more generous to the K-12 public schools budget, whereas the Senate was a little bit more generous to the UNC university budget. And that's mostly held true given the current leadership as well. So unfortunately, I am not expecting any good things from the Senate budget, even though they've taken oaths to the Constitution to uphold our state constitution. Our state constitution says that students should have access to decent schools, and our courts have decided that courts have determined over the past 30 years that the state's not meeting that obligation. I think it's sadly going to be sort of business as usual, and that whatever budget we get out of this process is not going to look too much different than last year's.
Yeah, and so for people who are watching who may not know what Kris is referring to, we're talking about the 2+ decade year-long constitutional case of Leandro versus the state of North Carolina, where all of our students, no matter where they are supposed to receive a constitutionally mandated sound education, and we are we want every kid to have a high quality public education, so moving beyond basic. So that is what Kris is talking about. And so one of the things I want to ask you, Kris, is first of all, why do you can you explain why we do our budget in a 2-year cycle?
Um, I don't know the history of why we do a 2-year budget cycle. So, what Tamika's referring to is in odd years like 2023, the General Assembly passes a 2-year budget. Um, probably dates back to when it was hard for a lot of legislators to get to Raleigh, and to cut down on travel. They would pass a 2-year budget, and then the next year they were supposed to just be making sort of minimal changes and adjustments in the even year budget, what they call the short session. Um, the way things work functionally, yeah. So this is a 2-year budget that we're talking about that they'll be passing. Functionally, the way the process works is not too different in a short session versus a long session anymore. They really go through the whole thing again in the even number years, even though they're supposed to be making small tweaks. They do sort of look at it as like a fresh start, to sort of craft the budget they want, and they don't necessarily feel obligated to hold themselves to what they passed in the prior year.
Okay, good. That is helpful information, even if we don't know where it originates from, because when we talk about short session and long session, many of us, all of us, know about the marathon sessions lately. Our General Assembly has been having around crafting the budget, especially how we ended up in 2019 with no state budget, right? So we are all familiar with that. And so I do want to ask you this other question, thinking about ways that we as educators, right, can continue to be a part of the process. What would you recommend? What are great ways for educators to be involved?
Well, I think it's a difficult process. It's long, but there are certain points along the way where there are sort of leverage points, and it requires paying attention to the process. So, and you are all in the classrooms every day and don't have time to sit around on Twitter and stream public meetings to find out what's going on. You guys are doing important work. I have time to be on Twitter and attend meetings and stream the meetings and summarize the meetings for folks. So definitely try to follow me. I know your liaisons certainly do, of course, do great work following what's going on in Raleigh and summarizing it. How do we influence these things? At this point, I'm sort of two minds, because on one hand, legislators do notice when they get a lot of mail, when they get a lot of emails, especially if it is directed towards them personally and it's not a form email. They do take note of that. They do take note of phone calls. They do take note of people showing up in their offices. So those are important things. It's it doesn't take too many people to make a impression. That said, the ideological differences, the extremist makeup of the current General Assembly leadership that has, very anti-public schools, is an unfortunate reality in this state. And we, together have been trying to change that. And we haven't changed it yet. We keep pushing, but we haven't changed it yet. So what will what will compel them to create budgets that actually provide you all with the tools you need to be successful and ensure all of your kids have the opportunity to achieve state standards no matter their backgrounds? I I wish I had the answer to that. We need to keep brainstorming and keep thinking of new ideas and keep thinking of sort of innovative ways to push them to start doing the right thing.
Oh, I appreciate that response. And for people watching, Kris is telling you like all the right things. We need to tell our stories to our legislators and
Mm.
actually, go and speak to them where they are when they come back home to our communities, because they just didn't show up in Raleigh. They came from our neighborhoods and our cities and towns. So we need to remind them about our priorities to make sure
Mhm.
every student gets a high quality public school and an educator that belongs in it. And so, Kris, we are almost at the end of our time. See, I told you it would go really, really fast. But do you think there's anything else that our public education community, educators, parents, community allies, what do you think they should know about this process as it continues to move forward?
Um, well, I would say that the important thing to think about is really just keeping track. Obviously, y'all are going to keep track of teacher pay, but keeping track of compliance with Leandro is the thing that I'm paying most attention to. One of the things that's happened over the past 12 years at this point is that districts have way fewer self-directed resources to really address and adapt their budgets to really meet local needs. To the extent there have been increases in state budgets, largely they've reflected the increase in the number of students over the past decade, you know, increases in pay, even though they haven't kept pace with inflation. But mostly it's been increases in the cost of benefit packages. So your retirement and healthcare, those costs of those benefits have skyrocketed. Obviously, the generosity of those packages, your healthcare hasn't gotten any better, but what the state's paying for it has gone way up. Your retirement benefits haven't gotten any more generous, but what the state has paying to maintain those benefits on an annual basis has gone way up. So schools are left with a lot less money, and that's really what this Leandro plan is trying to remedy. So I'm certainly trying to stay on top of that and trying to encourage legislators to provide districts with more self-directed resources, and increase those allotments, those things like the DSSF allotment, limited English proficiency, children with disabilities, that are geared towards providing districts with flexibility, but also towards flexibility towards helping the students that have been left behind the most due to a decade plus of austerity budgets.
Yes, and so thank you for highlighting how important it is not only for us as regular everyday citizens, right, to be paying attention to this budget, but also watching about how much of the state shifts its responsibility to the local and what the locals can do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so being mindful of that, but then also, just again, awareness is key, right? To make sure that we are all paying attention to what's going on with this budget. Because you also mentioned the thing about how it goes into the conference report, and like, can we just change the conference report, or if it's a vote up or down? And isn't that correct?
Correct. Yeah. So during the House and the Senate budget processes, there are generally opportunities for members to offer amendments. So when the budget goes to the Appropriations Committee, generally members of the Appropriations Committee are allowed to offer amendments, and sometimes things get snuck through there. On the House floor, again, generally amendments are allowed. But with the conference budget, once each of them have had their turn, and they've worked out their differences. That budget, they don't provide an opportunity for amendments on that.
Right. So again, it's that, government transparency piece that's also really important to us as citizens, right? To be able to offer our voices into the process. And so I just want to thank Kris for being on with us this evening. Now, Kris, if people want to reach out to you and ask you more questions about the North Carolina budget process, how do they get in contact with you?
Absolutely. Please do. I did not, there's so much more we could have talked about tonight, and I'm happy to talk about budgets. I've been working on budgets again for almost 2 decades. So if you need to get in touch with me, my email is Kris, that's KRIS, at ncjustice.org, or you can find me on Twitter at Kris Nordstrom.
Awesome, awesome. Now, I'm telling you, Kris is a wealth of knowledge, y'all. So please do go and hit him up for information. And Kris, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you to everyone who joined our conversation this evening. Now, NCAE family, I want you to know we look forward to having those conversations with our legislators around our priorities for students and public schools when we go to the General Assembly. So we want you to join a legislative contact team, and we want you to reach out to your legislators. So, and for everybody to know, Tuesdays with Tamika is now a bi-weekly program. So the next time you see me, it will be on April 18th. So go ahead and mark your calendars for April 18th at 6 o'clock. And so we want to thank you all for tuning in tonight. Again, thanking Kris for being on. And we will see you all next Tuesday. Have a good one.
See you guys. Thanks.